Hello everyone and welcome back to another reaction video. Today we are watching the channel OverSimplified and their videos on the French Revolution. This is part 1 of that series. So without further ado, let's get going.
So I said to the Marquis de la Fufayette, "What do you think I am? Some dirty peasant? I've never worked a day in my life." Wow, that Marie Antoinette sure is pretty. Sure is. Wouldn't want to be Prince Louis though. That's going to be a lot of responsibility when he becomes king, especially since France is in financial ruin. Quite. Thank you one and all for attending the royal marriage of my grandson, the future king of France, to the Archduchess of Austria.
Yes, the royal marriage between the heir to the French throne, the future Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette, the Archduchess of Austria, came about as the result of the so-called diplomatic revolution of 1756, in which France and Austria, traditional rivals and enemies, suddenly, or not suddenly, but as a result of circumstances in Europe, especially the 7 Years' War against Britain and Prussia, abandoned these past grievances and formed an alliance. And of course, to cement alliances back in the day, it was very common to do so via marriage, and that is exactly what happened in this case. So in 1770, this matchmaking was concluded.
Now for the very awkward yet historically accurate part of the ceremony, where we all watch them get into bed together. All right, now that's out of the way, let's leave the royal couple to it. You better give us an heir, you fat, ill-bred boy. Nighty-night.
Yes, the bedding ceremony, as we call it, was pretty standard practice back in the day. Nowadays, it seems very, very strange indeed. But this was often done in front of numerous witnesses, family, friends, even neighbors in some cases. Perhaps not this occasion. However, uh, by witnessing the bedding, the marriage was completed, the marriage act. But the purpose of the ritual originally was to establish that the marriage had been consummated by witnessing the couple's first sexual intercourse or by leaving just before the consummation of the marriage. Now, in Louis the 16th case and Marie Antoinette, the marriage was not consummated for, I believe, 7 years, and that led to a lot of bad PR in the years to come.
That's gonna be a lot of responsibility. France is in financial ruin. You fat, ill-bred boy. Quite. That's gonna be a lot of responsibility. France is in financial ruin. You fat, ill-bred boy. That's gonna be a lot of responsibility. Oh, great. He's a freaking weirdo. France, the most prosperous, cultured, and beautiful nation in the world, as it had been for centuries.
Yeah, that's exactly right. 18th century France was a true powerhouse of Europe. It was the foremost European great power, and it was so because its population was second only to Russia. It had 28 million citizens. It had a large and thriving colonial empire. Its GDP was 3 times as big as Britain's at this point, and they had the largest land army and a very powerful navy, perhaps second only to the British, which of course would remain the naval masters until the end of World War II. All this combined meant that they were a very powerful country, and also they had a lot of soft power. Many French philosophers came to have a very big impact on the Enlightenment, and they dominated in literature, fashion, And French, the language, was the second language of most European nobility and royalty. So France, although in modern days portrayed as this country that surrenders after 6 weeks, um, really was the greatest power in Europe for a very, very long time.
An exquisite social culture, with the king and the upper classes throwing crazy parties every night, enjoying high living and fine dining. Who cares that they were only able to do so off the backs of the hard-working, starving poor? What are they gonna do? Revolt? They're only 80% of the population. No.
Actually, that's a pretty low estimate. The numbers I've seen indicates it's at least 85, maybe as much as 88%. So the third estate, as it was called, really dominated the population, although having no privileges or wealth that came with being so many.
Life in France is great. What's that, France? You want to go to war with Britain and increase your power? Go for it, little buddy. You do you. And
Yes, the 7 Years' War is seen by many historians as being the first true global conflict, and I tend to agree. The war was fought in every continent and ocean, except Antarctica, of course. But basically, without going into the details, France suffered some heavy setbacks in the 7 Years' War. Their land armies was defeated by Frederick the Great of Prussia at Rossbach in 1757. They lost New France, i.e. Canada, and the French East India Company, who waged a proxy war against the British East India Company, lost a lot of influence after the 7 Years' War in India. So the 7 Years' War was a disaster, not only militarily, but also economically, since waging a war on this scale was extremely extremely expensive.
And you lost. Now you're in severe financial debt. We have no money. What do? Should we stop partying? Heck no. Party harder. That's okay. The peasantry will pick up the slack. They were created by God to do all the work, and you were created to reap all the benefits and party hard. That's just how society works, and we've all just accepted.
Yes, the social hierarchy as it is portrayed here is an old feudal leftover at this point. Well, it's still in place in many European countries. It's very archaic. Uh, Basically, we have the first estate, it's the clergy, the servants of God and the Catholic Church. The second estate is the nobility. Now, the nobility is divided into, you could say, two main classes. You have the nobles of the robe, those who have received their title of, they received nobility by purchasing high political or judicial office, and then they passed those those titles down to their children. And then we have nobles of the sword, and these are the old knightly classes that had been aristocratic landowners in France for a long time, ever since the medieval period, and they are considered the more, pioneer nobility or upper nobility of France. And then we have the third estate, of course, the peasants, the middle class, the the wealthy merchant class. All of them were crammed into the third estate. So you could see how this system would be quite upsetting to a lot of people, to the vast majority.
It for centuries. Why? Why what? Why do the nobility get to be all rich and stuff? Just because they were born into it? And the rest of us schmucks just have to accept that?
Pretty much.
Hell, why do we even need a king? Who decided that? It all just seems very unfair and unequal, and I, for one, am starting to question it. Wow, that's very enlightened of you. And so began the Age of Enlightenment. Great philosophical thinkers.
Yes, the Age of Enlightenment was an intellectual and philosophical movement during the late 17th, early 19th centuries, when, it was a very broad movement. The values espoused by the Enlightenment thinkers was the pursuit of reason, evidence of the senses, natural law, constitutional government, toleration, fraternity, separation of church and state. Very progressive ideas for the time, and these are the ideas that make up modern Western society. So this is a very pivotal period in European history, and France would be at the center of it.
Across France and beyond began to question whether this beautiful nation was really all that beautiful after all. Hey, Prince Louis, bad news. Your grandpop died of smallpox this morning, which means good news, you're now the king. So just to sum up, France is in severe financial debt, and the angry populace are beginning to question how necessary you are. But hey, I believe in you, champ. You got this. Maybe. Oh no! Prince Louis Capet became King Louis XVI in May 1774. He was a notoriously weak man, and he knew it. He barely had the wisdom to rule a nation, never mind one in crisis, and he was easily manipulated by those around him. One of his...
Yes, now many people see Louis as a very incompetent man. Yes, he was definitely competent, that is my view too. However, his main problem was that he was just a weak and vacillating character who bowed before the nobility when he correctly identified one of the main problems that were causing a lot of social strife in France at the time, particularly the unfair system of taxation. And Louis made several attempts to actually reform the taxation system. So had his grandfather, Louis XV. But they all failed because of stark resistance from the nobility.
First acts was to try to get revenge on the British by financing their American colonies' revolution. Hey, we're an independent nation now. That was real swell of you, Louis.
Yes, the French were actually very successful in supporting the American revolutionaries, and it must be said, and I'm sorry if I'm upsetting any American viewers here, but it must be said that without French support, the American Revolution is almost doomed to fail. That's how crucial French support was. Of course, for France, this was a way of, getting back at Britain. However, the war was extremely expensive, and, the French state was basically out of money. They had to loan money to cover all of these costs. And with time, the creditworthiness of France sunk, so they could only loan at higher interest rates. So when the revolution starts in 1789, the French state is in debt perhaps as much as 8 to 12 billion livres, which was an enormous sum of money. Quite incomprehensible, actually.
Couldn't have done it without you. Glad I could help. So
of course, they didn't get paid by the Americans.
When can we get that back? Yep, you're a great guy. I'll never forget what you've done for us. Real glad I could help, friend, but about that money, gotta go now, chum. Best of luck to you. Oh, no. And now France was in even more debt. France's poor, suffering under the strain of economic ruin, watched as the nobility continued to live as though nothing was wrong. In particular, they grew increasingly disdainful of the Queen, Marie Antoinette, as she continued to spend all of France's money on her own luxurious lifestyle.
Yes, this is a problem with Marie Antoinette. She was very aloof in that sense, that she was not aware of how bad PR this was. Her constant lavish parties and overall lifestyle really grating against many of the lower classes of France.
And fashion, while the peasants were breaking their backs in the fields, she was walking around like, hey, my hair is about. I'm not making that up.
Literally.
Her hair really was about. And her lavish spending earned her the nickname Madame Deficit. And speaking of the Queen, there was also a long-standing scandal around the fact that the king took a very long time to boink her, and the working classes of Paris began ridiculing the royal couple with lewd pamphlets.
That's what I referenced
the Queen
earlier.
As a court thought, and the king as a wuss, unable to fulfill his marital duty. Respect for the monarchy was at an all-time low, as France's finances were spiraling out of control, and the king and his aides really only had one solution to the crisis: tax the poor. Tax the poor. We could do a sexy calendar shoot. Tax the poor. And so it was. The poor, who were already struggling to make ends meet, found themselves being taxed from every direction. Hey, I'm the royal tax collector. Looks like you've yet to pay.
Yes, indeed. Now, as we've already touched on a bit, Louis XVI and Louis XV have tried to institute tax reform that would ensure that the nobility and clergy paid some taxes, at least something. But this could not be implemented. And so, where do you turn? Well, you'll have to turn to the third estate and tax them even more. And not only are there royal taxes to be collected, but the church also taxes the third estate through the tithe and through other various religious contributions. So yeah, the situation was very bad for the third estate.
Your income tax, head tax. By the way, how many windows you got in that house of yours? 3? Oof, yep. There's gonna be a tax for that. Hey, your local priest.
The window tax was
a
the thing.
Church tithe yet? Well, at least this one is going to the good work of God. Sure.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
God. I think this year God wants me to buy a new swimming pool. Hey, private tax collector here. Oh, and I brought some goons with me. Just a few quick questions. How much salt did you buy this year? About 7 kilos, I think? Yep. Okay, there's gonna be a tax for that. Oh.
Yeah, the salt tax in particular was extremely unpopular.
What's that over there? And that's extra salt I held over from last year, so I wouldn't have to buy as much this year. Oh, yeah, there's a tax for that. And what are you doing with all this salt? Well, obviously cooking. On the table. Yep. And preserving fish and meat. Oh no. Yep. And there's a tax for that. Hey, how old is he? He's 9. And so he's purchased his required amount of salt for this year, right? What? No, he's 9. Uh-oh. Sorry, little Timmy. Looks like I'm gonna have to tax you for that. Yep. Salty. There's going to be a tax for that. And that's not all. A huge portion of the peasants' harvest had to be given up. And there was also the labor tax, where peasants were required to work a certain number of days for their local lord without pay. Obviously, people weren't too happy with these taxation policies, and the aggressive nature of these private tax farmers sometimes even escalated to violence. In particular, though, the people really hated how inconsistent the taxation.
Yes, this is one of the main problems with the French taxation system and overall administration and of the country, is that administration and governance was not uniform throughout the country. The amount of tax you had to pay varied widely depending on where you lived. For example, here in Brittany, for example, on the northern coastline, northeastern coastline, yeah. Well, there you had no salt tax at all, while in others you definitely had it. So you could see how this was very annoying to many people. Well, it was good for those who had low tax rates, of course, but overall the situation was pretty darn bad. And why, could you ask? Well, this is due to the fact that during the Middle Ages, the French state expanded in various ways through a mix of marriages, alliances, and conquest. And as a result, the law codes between the various regions and provinces varied widely. And this problem would not be fixed until Napoleon came to power in 1799.
Were across the nation, and also the fact that the first 2 estates often had to pay very little, if any, tax at all. And so, the anger continued to grow. France had a population that was just about ready to explode. What could push them over the edge? How about a touch of natural disaster? A series of harsh summers and winters left the peasants' harvests in ruin, meaning they had no food or money, and the cost of bread skyrocketed. Of course, the upper classes had massive stocks of grain and wheat, so they were virtually untouched by this new crisis. But now the poor really were starving, and they began to riot. Women took to the streets, bakeries were raided, and bakers suspected of keeping bread for themselves were sometimes even hanged. Wow, this is really getting out of control.
Yeah.
Your Majesty, we need some decisive action. You need to step.
The situation at this point is escalating more and more, and with the onset of inflation on food prices, things just started to boil over completely.
Up and lead us. What will you do? Okay, I've got this. I know. I'll summon the Estates General, and they'll decide what to do. You really are a fat, ill-bred boy. The Estates General was the closest thing France had to a government, apart from the king. It was a purely advisory body, and was rarely summoned. In fact, it hadn't been summoned for 175 years prior.
Yes, the Estates General is the closest thing France has to a parliament, and it was not a parliament like the British one at this time, or it was purely a, a advisory assembly consisting of representatives for the various classes, and their decisions didn't have any legal ramifications. The king was absolute in his power, and this was due to Louis XIV centralizing power under the royal government during the 1600s, and as such, the Estates General had not met since 1614, and that's a lot of years that the king had ruled absolutely, but the crisis had simply spiraled out of control, and they were left with no option but to try this nuclear option, you might want to call it, because expectations were not that high that things would actually get done here. And it didn't, as it turns out.
To this. But with France in a severe crisis, the king felt the time was right to call on the government to help. The Estates General was made up of representatives from the three estates, that is, the clergy, the nobility, and everybody else. Okay, thanks for coming, everyone. The first order of business is regarding the clergy and nobility. You all get brand new Porsches. You get a Porsche, and you get a Porsche, and you get a Porsche. Everybody gets a Porsche. And now into the second order of business. France is completely out of money.
Yeah, that small problem.
It's never been this bad before. Anyone got any ideas? How about we all get Lamborghinis next time? The king decided that in order to make a decision, they had to come up with a voting system. Okay, the clergy. You have a population of 130,000, so you'll get 1 vote. The nobility. You have a population of 350,000, so you'll also get 1 vote. And the third estate. You have a population of 27 million people and make up 98% of the population. Very impressive. You'll get
1 vote.
1 vote. The third estate were obviously pretty unhappy with this system because they kept on finding that this would happen. We propose to raise taxes on the third estate. All in favor? All opposed? 2 to 1. Taxes will be raised on the third estate. We propose a motion that says the first 2 estates are a bunch of poo-poo heads. All in favor? All opposed? 2 to 1. It's official. We are not poo-poo heads. The third estate realized that any attempt at reform would be outvoted by the 2 upper estates, and they thought that was kind of lame. So they decided that since they were 98% of the population, they could go off to form their own government, make their own laws, and take over the running of the country. And so, the National Assembly was born. The third estate was now in control, and there was nothing the king could do to stop. Haha! I've locked you all out of your building. What are you gonna do about it? We'll probably go find a different building.
Yeah, this is actually something Louis XVI did. He didn't allow them to use their original building they were gonna meet up at, so they just moved somewhere else. Go figure.
That isn't locked. Ow, no! The National Assembly did find another unlocked building, just down the road, an indoor tennis court, where on the 20th of June 1789, they all took the tennis court oath, pledging to continue meeting until the king finally gave in to their demands for more equality and economic reform. This new National Assembly included many of the most educated members of the Third Estate, including 2 young lawyers by the names of Maximilien Robespierre and
Yes, we will be hearing a lot about Maximilien Robespierre and Georges Danton, the revolutionary leaders that becomes, these are the most famous revolutionary leaders that people would know about, especially Robespierre. Perhaps not as much Danton.
Georges Danton. Some members of the first 2 estates even joined their cause. Some of these men formed a radical new political party called the Jacobin Club.
Yes, the Jacobin Club was the most popular political faction during the revolution, and it was primarily consisted of the middle class. And as I've said in Napoleonic Wars video reaction, the Jacobin Club would have a great influence inspiring leftist politics during the 19th and 20th century. So the Jacobin Club was a really powerful faction that most people probably, if they know anything about the French Revolution, they would probably recognize the term Jacobin, but not any of the other factions, because let's be clear, there were a lot of factions during the revolution that struggled for control over the direction of both the country and the revolution itself.
And quickly became leading figures, while many members of the Third Estate simply wanted more equality. A growing number in this Jacobin faction would begin calling for something even crazier: the removal of the king.
Yes, the Jacobins were probably the most radical faction, should also be mentioned. There were moderates and royalists too, but they were not heard as much as the Jacobins were.
Entirely. And this is where fear began to take hold. With such a volatile situation developing, everyone was afraid of something. The king feared his position was under threat, and he called in the military to take position around Paris. The Third Estate heard rumor of the gathering military force, and they feared the king was planning to round them up and arrest them. Maybe he'd even execute them. It also didn't help that the king had just dismissed France's popular finance minister.
Yes, Jacques Necker was originally a Genevan banker who served as the finance minister in several brief periods during Louis XVI's reign, and he was quite popular. He tried to institute some tax reforms that made him popular among the public, but the nobles demanded he be dismissed, and Louis XVI, vacillating and weak as he was, agreed, only to bring him back several times until finally, Necker had it, and he left the government permanently.
Who had been trying to make reforms himself. It seemed the king was done negotiating. Fear, left unchecked, often boils over into anger, and anger detonates with violence. The angry people of Paris, after centuries of cruel inequality, harsh oppression, even starvation, fearful of having their new movement for reform demolished so soon, decided that it was now or never to take action. Screw reform. They decided they'd do one better. How about revolution? The people of Paris, believing the French military was preparing to attack, decided they should arm themselves. The National Assembly announced the creation of a bourgeois militia, the National Guard, and immediately many troops from the French military defected over to the revolutionary side.
Yes, the National Guard would become this middle-class militia. During the Napoleonic Wars, it would serve as the internal troops of France. It would only really be used in Napoleon's campaigns during the end, when there was a severe lack of manpower. So they were not meant for combat, but to maintain internal security. And, the National Guard was eventually abolished at the end of the century. However, they were resurrected in about, around 2015, around that time. The National Guard was resurrected because of the terrorist attacks that took place in France during that time. So the National Guard has a very long history of internal security, so to speak.
The early hours of July 14th, 1789, a large crowd stormed and raided the Hôtel des Invalides, a military hospital where they were able to...
Yes, the Hôtel des Invalides, I think I pronounced that correctly. This is where Napoleon's sarcophagus is actually held, and the graves of many of France's famous generals and leaders. So if you're in Paris, check that out. Could be interesting.
Secure a large number of rifles. The bad news was they weren't able to find any gunpowder for their new weapons. The good news was they knew exactly where to get some. A prison fortress and a symbol of royal tyranny towering over Paris, the Bastille. Mid-morning, the crowd gathered around the Bastille and demanded that the man in charge, Governor Delaunay, surrender the prison and hand over the gunpowder. Obviously, Governor Delaunay was like, no way. So he stalled for time by inviting a few members of the crowd in for negotiations. The crowd, still waiting outside, quickly became impatient, and before long, they stormed the fortress, taking on the French troops inside. Your Majesty, we've received word that the people have surrounded the Bastille. Governor Delaunay will hold them off. No need to worry.
No, he won't.
Actually, Your Majesty, it appears the crowd is now headed away from the Bastille. You see? What did I tell you? Clearly Governor Delaunay has defeated them and has them on the run. No need to worry. Your Majesty, isn't that Governor Delaunay's head on a pike? Well, clearly Governor Delaunay has taken on the form of a bodiless pike-head deity, and
Yes,
the people are so
that's exactly
enamored
what
with
it
him,
is.
They're parading him around the city. No need to worry at all. When the National Assembly heard about the violence that had taken place, they had two options. Either one, they denounce it and try to carry on the revolution using peaceful means, or two, they say, damn, you stuck his head on a pike? That's pretty hardcore. And we love it. Incidentally, they went with option number 2.
Yes, this is the start of the bloody chapter of the French Revolution, you could say. This was the first real instance of political violence, and it would only continue to deteriorate the longer the revolution went on, especially when Robespierre was in charge. But we'll see that in the next part, I believe.
Some historians believe this reaction paved the way for the utter violence and bloodshed that would become the legacy of the French Revolution. This widespread acceptance of violence during the Revolution is also largely credited to the writings of a certain Jean-Paul Marat, a man of science with a horrible skin condition that kept him confined to a bathtub. He began writing a radical newspaper he affectionately named The Friend of the People. Citizens of France, be very afraid. Given the chance, the king and the nobility won't hesitate to massacre us all. The solution is simple. Execute them. Kill every last one of them. Cut off 1,000 heads, and if that's not enough, cut off 1,000 more. Oh, hey, Mr. Squeaky. What are you doing down there? You're so cute. Aw, I love you too, Mr. Squeaky. Mwah. Now, where was I? Oh, yeah. Kill them all. It became one of the most popular publications in Paris during the Revolution and succeeded in spreading ever-increasing fear and anger among the people. In August, leaders of the National Assembly, with help from a certain Thomas Jefferson, adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen.
Yes, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen is one of the most important documents in modern Western history, perhaps all of Western history really, alongside the American Declaration of Independence, which incidentally inspired this document. Basically, this was a civil rights document, you could call it. It contained various, rights for citizens that would be very important in shaping the constitutions and popular conceptions of individual liberty and democracy in Europe going forward. So yeah, I'm guessing he's going to talk about it right now.
An incredible document that guaranteed liberty and equal rights to all men. And when I say men, I mean men. Despite its glaring shortcomings,
well, you can't have everything, am I right?
The massively influential declaration would go on to inspire the struggle for liberty and equality across the planet for centuries. However, back in France, the vast majority of the people weren't really so concerned with enlightened ideas of equality as much as they were concerned with the fact that they were still starving. Bread was still expensive as hell and hard to come by. The people felt that one reason nothing had been done yet about the crisis was because the king simply couldn't see the problem. He lived in Versailles, a full 20 kilometers southwest of Paris, and as a result, lived in comfort.
Yes, Versailles was this originally a royal hunting lodge that turned into this amazing, beautiful, and incredibly lavish palace complex, which it happened under the reign of Louis XIV. And Louis XIV used this palace complex to gather all French nobility at court, where he could keep an eye on them, and that's a key part in how Louis XIV actually centralized the royal authority in France during the Age of Absolutism. But that's beside the point. The king continued to live here, and now the people of France, Paris more specifically, wanted him to live closer to the people. We'll see how that goes.
Separated from his dirty, stinking subjects. On October 5th, a crowd of women, 7,000 strong, decided they'd do something unprecedented. They decided they'd remove that separation and confront the king directly. The women marched all the way to the king's palace in Versailles, Along the way, the crowd continued to grow into the tens of thousands, and when they arrived, they demanded an audience with the king. What are those things outside the palace? They're poor people, Your Majesty. That's poor people? They say they're hungry. Hungry? Then let them eat cake. Wow. See, this is the...
Yes, the "let them eat cake" is perhaps the most famous quote attributed to Marie Antoinette, but in reality, the term or the quote had originated in 1765 when she was 9 years old, and it's very likely that she didn't say any of it. But that doesn't mean she didn't have that sort of attitude towards the common people of France. She certainly seemed to.
exact BS that led to this whole mess in the first place. You're so out of touch.
She
They're
was out
writhing
of
around
touch.
in the filth, breaking their back to barely scrape by, and they come to you demanding just the basic ability to feed themselves, and you think a slice of cake will sort them out? Well, then let them eat Taco Bell Crunchwrap Supreme.
Oof.
Wow. They're not that desperate. Members of the crowd actually managed to break into the palace with the intention of killing the queen, who narrowly escaped through a secret passage in her bedroom. The enraged mob killed several members of the royal guard and raised their heads on pikes, which, if you haven't noticed yet, is something they were quite fond of doing. The king had no choice but to come out and talk to the crowd. He agreed to accept his new position, sharing power with the revolutionary government, and to return to Paris with the crowd, removing the separation between king and subject. King Louis had a problem with people constantly raiding his palace, but one thing he didn't have a problem with was people raiding his computer.
Ah, yes. I believe we are reaching the end of the video here. Yes. Alright. That was the French Revolution Part 1 by OverSimplified. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have anything to add, leave a comment. Please like the video and subscribe for more. Until then, bye.